Hi, I'm Matt and welcome back to Matt's Money Matters. In part one of this episode, we were exploring the causes of the bank panic of 1907. And in this episode, we're going to look at how capitalism saved itself. In episode 1, we saw the Heinz family failed to corner the market for United Copper stock. Some of the company's shares had been used for loan collateral by banks associated with the family, and that led depositors to start withdrawing their money. The impact quickly spread through New York's financial system, leading depositors in other banks and trusts to start withdrawing their money too, and it became a bank panic. And now one of my favourite moments in the history of capitalism, John Pierpont Morgan. You know his name from JPMorgan Bank. He helped create US Steel, and he returns via rail car to New York from a religious conference to save the day. So where we left off, the big problem was with the Knickerbocker Trust Company. It was the third largest in New York, and depositors were worried about its solvency and starting to take out their cash. As a bank run started to form, there was a potential that it would knock out other financial institutions linked to the Knickerbocker. So JP Morgan sends a couple of the boys over to look at the books. Not good. Knickerbocker's not going to make it. And now everybody stopped lending money. Share prices fell. The story goes people were lining up outside banks like people do these days for Apple iPhones, camping out overnight, paying people to hold their places. On Tuesday, JP and some other bankers met with the US Treasury Secretary, George Cortelyou. Cortelyou put about $25 million into JP's hands. That was about 3% of the budget for the United States back then. John D. Rockefeller, a huge oil tycoon, deposited $10 million into one of the banks. He called up a journalist and he promised to pledge half of his wealth to underwrite the credit for the US banking system. Massive call. And the intention was it would bring trust and confidence back. People knew that they'd be able to get their loans paid eventually if they were being underwritten by someone who had the assets that Rockefeller had. So on to the first big battle. JP Morgan brought all the trust presidents together and he said, hey guys, do you want to sort out a bailout for these trust funds that are falling over to save the system? None of these guys knew each other. But at this point, there was one big positive. The boys had a look at the books for the Trust Company of America and they said, you know what? This place is ultimately pretty sound. And Morgan said, this is the place to stop the trouble then. And so it was. Some banks chipped in $3 million so the trust company could limp on. Battle number 2. All of this concern about people paying loans or not paying loans meant that the stock exchange, the brokers, didn't have financial flows coming through and stock prices started to crash. The president of the New York Stock Exchange, Ransom Thomas, went to visit JP Morgan and he said, we need about $25 million ASAP or 50 brokerage companies are going to go under. And by the way, I want to shut the stock exchange early. And Morgan said, no, don't do that. People will freak out. Don't worry. I'll see if I can source you some money. So again, he gets the bankers together and he says, you guys have got 10 or 12 minutes to get those stacks of cash together. Otherwise, we're going to have a disaster on our hands. And you best believe, within 16 minutes, they had all the money pledged. The story goes, he sent his staff down to the stock exchange to let them know that these loans were now available. And a massive roar erupted from the floor of the exchange, and Morgan, who was across the street, said, what's going on? And it turned out they were giving him a standing ovation. Battle number 3. At this point, there was a shortage of cash in New York City, and that can cause massive problems. Like in the Great Depression, there was a shortage of money around to finance financial flows. It led to banks collapsing and it prolonged the pain that people felt. So Morgan headed to the New York City clearinghouse and he convinced them to issue some paper IOU notes basically to act as currency for a few weeks temporarily. And he and his team met with the clergy and said, over the weekend, please just tell everyone to chill out and calm down. On Monday, when New York City was close to insolvent and couldn't raise $30 million to continue operations, JP Morgan stepped in with some other bankers and underwrote the loan issue. So get this guy's 70 years old, he's basically fat, he smokes more than 20 cigars a day, he's got a bad cold, and he's working 19 hours a day, weeks on end, single-handedly stepping up to save the American financial system. And at the end of it, people say, He's a hero. People say, well, actually, maybe this is too much power for one guy. The big issue comes in battle number 5. That Trust Company of America and another trust, the Lincoln Trust, were on death's door. And there's a brokerage agency, Moore and Schley, which owed $25 million. The brokerage owned most of the shares in the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company. It was collateral for their loans, so there were 2 options. Either they could sell those shares and potentially smash the stock market, or the brokerage could go broke and potentially take out a lot of other brokerage houses with them. So Morgan got the commercial bankers in the east room of his house, the trust fund presidents in the west room of his house, locked some of these guys in the rooms, and sat in the center, apparently just playing solitaire by himself, and said, "You guys sort it out." As morning came, he came up with a plan. US Steel, a company that he had helped create, would buy Tennessee Coal and Steel, potentially violating a lot of anti-monopoly provisions, but saving financial markets, only on the condition that the trust companies got $25 million together to help bail out their weaker members. By 4:45 in the morning, he'd got the deal, and a couple of his lieutenants raced down to Washington to get approval. They needed approval from President Teddy Roosevelt because it violated anti-monopoly laws. And Roosevelt thought about it over breakfast, and a few minutes before the stock exchange opened, he gave the tick-off. The merger went ahead, the troubled trust funds had been saved, and a calm returned to Wall Street. There was still significant economic damage across the country, and we'll return to that in a moment. In his final battle, at least, JPMorgan emerged victorious. But he wasn't just victorious in an altruistic sense of making a difference. He'd managed to get one of his biggest companies, one of his favorite companies, to massively expand its market share. So immediately people were saying JP Morgan hoodwinked the president into doing this deal. And to be absolutely clear, the deal wasn't absolutely necessary. Like, he could have just put a cash injection into the brokerage house. And this is what people said afterwards. They said, why didn't he just do a cash injection? And it's like, to be honest with you, it's not this guy's job to bail out every failing financial enterprise in New York, is it? So the takeover deal cost $45 million. People later said that the value of Tennessee Coal and Steel's assets were closer to $1 billion. So he got it at a massive steal. Now, I don't believe that, because if the assets were actually valued that high, the brokerage company could have just sold off a small portion of what they owned and it wouldn't have impacted the share price. So obviously that's nonsense. I think even though JP Morgan might have personally done okay out of it, overall it was his presence, his drive, his determination that helped save the day. What I find fascinating about this is there was very little government intervention, and it's probably one of the last major crises, economic crises, where there was hardly any government intervention. There was no central bank in the US, and the federal government's main action was just depositing cash into New York banks. But the panic did significantly impact the US economy. The Economist reports that national output fell by about 11%. A very sharp drop. It also recovered reasonably sharply. And one of the reasons for this recovery was because of the creation of illegal private currencies to make up for that shortfall in cash. About 500 million in these private currencies was created. So was JP Morgan a hero or a villain? Let me know your thoughts. In the aftermath of it all, the big outcome was that the US decided they never wanted to have that much power in one person's hands again. And a few years later, the Federal Reserve banking system, the US central bank, was created. There's a lot of debate about the US Federal Reserve and its interventions in the economy, but that's maybe a topic for another video. Until then, thanks for joining me today, and remember, even in times of crisis, humanity always has a reason to be optimistic about the future.